You're listening to eLearnChat, where talk is knowledge.
Hello and welcome to eLearnChat, our new podcast featuring prominent leaders, shakers and movers in the e-learning and training industry. Your co-hosts are Rick Zanotti and Terrence Wing.
And hello, everyone. This is eLearnChat, where talk is knowledge. My name is Rick Zanotti, and I'm joined today by none other than Terrence Wing. Hey, Terrence, how are you?
I love having my own theme music. I don't think you're important in this world until you have your own theme music.
Gotta have theme music.
Absolutely.
Anyway, we've got a special guest today. Do you want to introduce our guest?
I think you've been pointing that off on me lately, so I've got to get more prepared at doing the introductions. You had done them for so long. But for all of you out there that are part of the e-learning community, this guest is no secret. Clark Quinn, Dr. Clark Quinn, is one of the, I like to think of him as a recognized thought leader, in that he's somebody, not one of those thought leaders that all you hear about is their book or their blog, but if you're at any type of e-learning guild event or ASTD events, you're bound to bump into Clark, and I think that's what really makes him an effective thought leader, as well as a very accessible one. So thank you, Clark, for that. And without further ado, I'll turn it over to Clark to introduce himself. How you doing, Clark?
Oh, well, thank you very much. I'm afraid I don't have my own theme music. It would change anyways. Right now it would be the Who's Going Mobile, if you're old enough to remember that one.
Well, we can give you some theme music. There we go. You now have music.
All right. It's official.
Play my own in theory, but I probably won't. Introduce myself. Learning and technology geek, learning experience design. I saw the connection between computers and learning as an undergraduate, and designed my own major. Went out and designed and programmed educational computer games for a couple of years before going back to grad school, and was effectively applied cognitive science. And continue to explore how do we use technology. And the neat thing about doing grad school with Don Norman was he talked about affordances. What are the key capabilities technology has that cutting away the hype and stuff and just saying, what is new here? And combining that with a deep understanding of how people learn, and using that to look, what can we do to continue to improve supporting people in achieving their goals along the way. I've realized that the goals have to go broader. We have to look at not just formal learning, but performance support and informal and social learning through my work with my colleagues in the Internet Time Alliance. Give them a shout out, Jay Cross, Harold Yarkey, Jane Hart, and Charles Jennings, really looking at the broader picture and increasingly strategically, how do we use technology to accelerate organizational performance so that we're not focused on learning, because it's not about learning. It's about performance at the end of the day. And we don't learn for intellectual self-gratification. We learn to actually be able to do things that we can't do now. And that's sort of the shift that not only do I believe in, but trying to evangelize, helping organizations get their minds around.
So you recently published a book, mLearning, or mobile learning, and how's the book doing?
Well, I haven't actually heard from the publisher, but I've heard nice things. A number of people have said they've got it either, the hard copy or on Kindle. So as far as I can tell, it's going great. We'll be eager to see the sales figures. Not that I'll really know how to interpret them without some context, but
sure.
We know, according to book publishers, no one ever makes any money selling books, but except the publisher. But that's another issue. That's a publisher issue. However, I do have your Kindle edition of the book, and I will actually go out and do a review of the book soon on Amazon for you. So you'll see that within the next week or so.
Oh, that would be great.
I think I might be the first one. It said, be the first to review. I go, okay, good, I will. I enjoy the book. It's well written, and you did a good job of putting out the concepts out there. We've been doing mobile development for quite a while. Before it was actually learning, we were doing mobile development for distribution, warehouses, manufacturing back when, and now you're taking it into the learning world, which is a lot of fun, and with tablets coming into being, that's a question for you. Everybody talks a lot about mobile learning on their phones. I don't think the phone's really the best platform for it, but what do you think about tablets and mobile learning?
I think they serve different purposes. I think for formal learning, tablets may make more sense. The larger screen makes it possible to get more involved. And there's a really intimate relationship, just the way, having that tablet close, it's not at arm's length like from a keyboard. But instead it's right up close and personal. But it's not with you necessarily always and everywhere you go. And so when you move from formal learning to performance support, I think the mobile phone may be the more plausible channel. There may be special instances, like in hospitals, where a nurse or a doctor is carrying around an iPad-type tablet. I should not be specific. A tablet. But when you're just everywhere you go, whenever you might need support, your phone is almost always with you. And that's why I think it's, in one sense, still sort of centers around your, mobile performance support, at least, is centered around the phone. And as they augment them with sensors of variety sorts, cameras and GPS and things, I think tablets are more a sit down and interact with, but the phone is more quick access, get it the information you need to be able to be more effective. And to me, mobile learning is about augmenting yourself. Our brains are really good at pattern matching. They're really good at bringing in models to understand the world, but they're really bad at doing rote things. And when we augment our brains, which do these things well, with these digital devices that do these other things well, together we're a more formidable problem solver. And that's really the mobile opportunity, I think, at least in terms of performance support.
Now, do you see on the phones video being more useful, or actually an authoring tool where you can actually use video or other elements to interact with? I
don't see either one as more. I think they each have their place. Video is a good communication tool, but it requires your attention focused in a particular place. Think of the GPS. There is visual support, but it's using auditory support because your attention has to be focused on the road. You want to use the right channel for the task and for the user and the context. And so you have to you want to have all these solutions on the table and pull them off as needed. Video is great when somebody can direct their attention to something or it conveys context and it's easily processed. But there's times when content, diagrams, and interactions are going to make more sense. Simulations may be the more powerful learning tool in a particular context. And then it may be documents, it may be the ability to communicate with somebody else. I talk about the 4 C's of mobile. There's content, which can be video or documents. There's capture, where you can capture video or audio or your text notes or even your location. There's computing, where it's really an interaction between you and the device, and it's adding computational capabilities that your brain can't handle. And then, of course, there's communicate, reaching out and touching the right person at the right time.
Now, Clark, there's one thing that I guess my mind is having a hard time grasping, and I suspect as I read through your book, I'll have my moments of clarity. But I'm really having and struggling with this separation of mLearning and e-learning, and especially with the sort of the death of the desktop, where most people now have laptops, and those laptops, have Wi-Fi, and they're just as mobile as any tablet is. And any phone. They may not be as small, but then they have more horsepower in many cases too. So I've been having a really hard time grasping why this term mLearning is emerging, and what makes it different than e-learning that I can do wherever I want to do it as long as I have mobile capability.
Well, indeed, and in a sense that goes back to Rick's point. The tablet, even if it's not a laptop, you could essentially have a fully learning experience with a tablet. You got the touch interface, but I mean the screen resolution is reasonably large enough. So, what is the difference between e-learning and mLearning? To me, e-learning is a full learning course, and I don't believe that courses on a phone is mLearning. Courses on a tablet, perhaps, but then we argued about whether laptops fit into the mobile learning definition when we did the mobile learning report for the eLearning Guild, and at the end of the day, we said no. And I have a small caveat to that. The reason it's just a desktop. You may be having your desktop tethered anywhere you want, but you're not doing anything unique to your current location, which is kind of what we're talking about with mobile learning, with caveat that it's not necessarily formal learning. And instead, so the tablet and the laptop really are just a desktop, except they're wherever you are. Now, if you do something context-specific with it, if because your laptop is here, as opposed to in that park or in your office or at your home, if there's something unique you're doing here, then it is mLearning. Same thing with a tablet. But it's really the context specificity. And so I like to separate out. To me, one of the things you do with mobile is augmenting formal learning. It's not replacing it. I don't want to see a whole course on a phone, maybe on a tablet, but then it's really serving as a desktop. But augmenting that learning, extending it, little bits that appear over time to do what I'm calling slow learning. And somebody complained and said it's really good learning or something because it's dribbling little bits over your life, which is more effective. The massed practice that we do with most of our learning, formal learning, isn't going to stick. So, slow learning is really more effective learning. It's not a contrary to rapid learning. But augmenting formal learning, extending it or doing something unique where you are or reactivating that knowledge and increasing the processing, that is one thing you do with mobile. And the other one is, again, performance support. It may also help you learn, but it's more specifically about helping you be a better problem solver in the moment. I can take a picture and share it with a colleague and get some help in figuring out this current situation. I can capture my performance here and take it away and review it later. I'm extending that. That's more a formal learning thing. I can calculate right now the contract price to this client and get closure right then instead of having to go back, calculate it, bring it back here. Or also, I'm about to go visit this client. The device knows it. It gives me some updates about that client right before I walk in. That's context specific. That's the type of mental shift you need to think, is that we don't do everything on one device in a massed event, whether it's in a room or on a desktop or a tablet, but we start breaking up, spreading it out, bringing the right thing at the right time. That's when we're talking, to me, that's when we're talking about mobile learning.
And it seems that mobile learning lends itself probably best to the performance support function. At least that's what we've seen it as throughout the years. That's what really kind of makes the most sense. With people out in the field, for example, they need information or they need something quickly. They may not have access to anything other than their local device, which could be a cell phone or maybe a tablet. Right now, it's pretty much cell phones for a lot of on-the-road personnel or people who are basically just not in an office. They're not tethered to a desk. We've seen this in airlines where they'll use, back in the old days, pocket PCs, 10 years ago. Now they're using cell phones with or devices specifically to do things. And some of their manuals are on those devices. Some of it is interactive. Some of it is online help. But they can get information, like you said, when they need it, if they need it, as kind of an additional have versus they don't have access to many of this, to a lot of this stuff at a desk. They're not at a desk.
Absolutely.
So then, go ahead, Clark.
Terrence.
Go ahead, Clark.
Okay. Well, absolutely. And increasingly, it's not just cell phones, it's smartphones. The interesting thing is that IDC did a study, I think it's a year or two old now, 72% of the workforce is mobile. And you think, wait a minute, granted I've got my sales force and maybe my field service technicians or something, but that's not 72% of my workforce. But when you have people making site visits occasionally, away at conferences, and they still have to stay in touch, they're mobile. Now they have a number device. They may have desktops, but they may not laptops, but they may not carry that around with them, when they're doing a site visit. They might have a tablet, but they'll certainly have a cell phone and increasingly a smartphone. And interestingly, the penetration of smartphones has only been about 15 to 20%. It's now at about 35%, and the estimate I just read, and I can't remember who made it, is that by the third quarter of this year, smartphones will have, or app phones, as David Poe calls them, will have reached 50% and more of the sales. People are beginning to recognize the value proposition of buying these app phones. And that's increased percentage, that's across all population. When you think of the knowledge workers, increasingly the people that are adding value to the organizations who need this support most, there's a higher percentage of smartphones out in the audience. And even if they keep a cell phone, they may have an iPod Touch or something, but it's a small portable device that has cameras and browsers and the ability to run apps, and that's the mobile learning opportunity. And yes, it is, and something else you said, Rick, that performance support is most of it. Mm-hmm. Currently, I think that is the real opportunity. But as we start breaking down the walls and start extending the learning experience into slow learning, the distinction is going to disappear. Gloria Geary, when she talked about electronic performance support systems, in the early 90s, talked about how they not only helped in the moment, but could develop you as a learner over time, so they'd help you learn as well. And we haven't really seen that. And I think that's the missed opportunity that's on the table, is to not just separate out, there's formal learning and there's performance support, but start taking the performance opportunities in your life. Because you go out, you take a course and then you go out and you have to perform. Can we precede that and follow that up? Precede that with some preparation and follow that up with some evaluation or reflection, and turn everything you do into a learning opportunity. And we might provide performance support during that performance as well, but we're losing the distinction. We're beginning to look at just a long-term relationship with the learner, helping them be more successful and develop them all at the same time. And that, I think is a really compelling vision for what we might be able to try and capture.
Well, it's sort of interesting, too, because if you look at, I forgot who it was that said it recently, but a lot of school is geared towards disengaging us. And most people, if you start talking about learning, they turn off. And yet if they're doing learning activities without realizing that they're learning, they're having the full benefit of learning without really realizing that, hey, they are actually learning. They're branching out. Their brains are recognizing, like you said, patterns. Patterns. They're recognizing things that they can then put to use later on or at the moment. Now, it's interesting. You were talking about cognitive learning, and really it does come down to patterns, how we perceive things, and I find that's a real fascinating subject. What do you see as cognitive learning, or where cognitive learning can really make a difference? I look at a lot of e-learning, and it's really awful. There's nothing that stimulates the brain. The colors are bad. The imagery doesn't relate to the subjects. There's very little use of, for example, neurolinguistic programming to highlight keywords that maybe you'll retain in your brain. We're not doing a lot of that. And those are things that I find really lacking for the most part in e-learning. What do you see as some of the areas where, or not only mobile, but just regular e-learning will benefit from a cognitive approach?
It's very clear that a lot of our e-learning does not take advantage of what we know about how our brains learn. We don't present learning objectives that matter to the learner. We don't give the appropriate concepts. We try and get people to remember rote information instead of focusing on skills. We don't give meaningful examples that have the cognitive annotation. We don't give practice that is scaffolded appropriately. We tend to do knowledge tests. It's very much broken. And it's, I understand that people are forced to do e-learning who haven't had the formal training and whatever. But an understanding of cognitive components of learning would really enhance, the formal learning that we do. And we also need to add in the emotion.
Mm-hmm.
How motivated are you? Can we increase your motivation by helping you understand why it's important, not just to you, the whiffing, what's in it for me, but why it's important in the real world, contextualize it.
Right, and if you have emotion into it, the retention ability will be probably 80% higher than with no emotion whatsoever attached to it.
I don't know about that.
It's a good number. I just made it up, but...
But absolutely. If people aren't opened up emotionally, this stuff just washes off them like they're coated with Teflon. You need to open them up emotionally as well as cognitively.
They don't relate to it if there's no emotion attached to it.
And you also have to remove anxiety. So it's not just motivation, but are they anxious? How many of you learn best when you're really anxious? It's not going to happen. So you want to address the cognitive and the conative in your formal learning. And I talk about that. The first book I wrote was on engaging learning, about designing e-learning simulation games, and it was largely about bringing in the emotional side as well, although there was a lot of elements about taking what we know about good cognitive learning as well. And I've looked at across learning. I've looked at behavioral, at cognitive, at constructivist, at social, I've looked at machine learning, trying to look for ways to make learning work better. And we do. There are lots of hints, and you sort of end up with a converged model. I love cognitive apprenticeship because to me it's, all the other instructional design models are converging. You look at, David Merrill, and he went from component display theory to ID2, and now he's at Ripples in the Pond. And I believe they're converging, and I think they're going to end up where cognitive apprenticeship started with. But I add a lot of stuff in of my own that they may not even agree with, but it's an elaborated model that tries to help focus. Now, the interesting thing is each of those elements can be teased apart, and then, as I say, as I've been hammering on probably too much today, spreading that out in little bits. And so we have the opportunity again to blend performance and learning together to have people overall more successful, but developed more successfully as well.
Terrence, what's going on in the chat room right now? Any questions?
Well, actually, Clark had answered the question that was out there. We had a question from Don about kind of getting back to our discussion on mLearning, which is why I didn't ask the question, because Don even agreed that the question was answered. But he was just asking within that context of, or that label of mLearning, if other tools beyond just the tablets were included. Like if you had 3D glasses, if you had mobile phones of some kind, or audience response systems. I mean, it sounds like from what Clark is saying that any tool that takes you away from your standard desktop / laptop stationary at your desk and puts you out into an environment where you're sort of learning and experiencing that learning through performance or performance support, that those devices would somehow be included in that. So at least that was what I got from you, Clark. So you can clarify that if I'm misquoting you.
No, absolutely. To me, when you look across the devices, and there's the handheld gaming platforms like a Nintendo DS or a PSP. There's the iPod, which is a music player, but it's programmable. And you look at or media players and phones and even cameras. There's something in common there. And when you abstract across these devices, you find out that it's really a digital, a compact processor with memory that is programmable, that has a way for you to put input into it, a way for it to provide feedback to you, way for it to connect to the world, and increasingly with sensors. That's what's at core in any device that fits that description, that you can get one of those 4 C's going, whether it can give you content, whether it can do some computation, whatever, begins to be a support tool for mobile learning.
Now, Rick, and I don't want to, beat a dead horse, although I don't think this is a dead horse, but Rick had mentioned performance support. And I guess that's another area where, I could see your difference between e-learning and mLearning based on your definition. And then it sounded like that definition pushed the mLearning into performance support, so, or electronic performance support even. So are we just putting lipstick on a different pig, I guess, is the analogy I could use here. Does mLearning truly have a different function than electronic performance support did 10, 15 years ago when we started to use technology more and more in the field to augment the learning and to more specifically to augment the performance, which in turn stimulated learning?
Actually, I don't think it's really any different. If you look at the best performance support, where there was a context, a task you were performing, and the smart software that ran on site, and realize the original electronic performance support systems were not, something special. They were just making up for bad interface design, and interface designers used to get pissed off and said, what they're doing is just good interface design, but they're having to graft it onto bad interfaces. But what they did is they knew where you were, what your goals were, or would query you, and then provide very specific support. Well, what we're just doing, I suppose the unique thing about mobile is decoupling that from the desktop and decoupling that from just software app performance tasks and taking out where we're trying to now augment whatever task you have to do, whether it's a dialogue with a customer, it's not technologically mediated, but understanding your tasks and providing custom context-specific support for, Wayne Hodgins a number of years ago said that, it's the right stuff, the right thing to the right person at the right time on the right device in the right way, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. That's what we're talking about is we now have the models, the ideal. And I sort of talk about three layers of mobile learning. There's the reactive, which just says you've got a bunch of content. You've got PDFs, you've got videos, you've got audio files. Make those available. And then the proactive says, what could we do with some of these content tools to bring things out, and who could we connect people with? And then finally, there's the custom that says, what could I build uniquely that would really provide a custom support, whether it's augmented reality, Google goggles, or anything else that would really help performers right in the moment. And so the ideal of mobile performance support would be this totally customized, contextualized, knowing where you are, when you are, what you're doing, and giving just the right thing. And I think that there are lots of steps we can take to get there. We have the models, we have the content. I really think, Arthur C. Clarke is right. Any truly advanced technology is indistinguishable from magic, and we have magic.
That's true.
We really do. There's no technological limits. But there's a lot more we can be doing with mobile learning, even without that whole contextualized stuff. Just making tools available, making people available, providing some support tools that we don't know when they're going to use them, but they're available when they need it. So they're the proactive person in this case, and John Seeley Brown talks about the power of pull. Providing support for people whenever they are is the first level of mLearning. That customized, contextualized, optimized support is a dream that we still want to work towards.
Now, Clark, I remember when I was in college, one of the big things was ELIZA. It was a natural language kind of artificial intelligence. It was actually programmed to respond to your questions. Now, in all the years I've been involved with learning, and indirectly it's been probably over 30, it's real interesting. I haven't yet seen much in terms of artificial intelligence and standard e-learning. None of the authoring tools really have anything even close to this, short of simple decision trees. How do we get, or is there anything you know of that's doing some natural language, some artificial intelligence, if you will, for training, where you could program in different kinds of scenario responses to make the learning much more realistic?
You have to be careful, because ELIZA actually wasn't that smart. It was just a Rogerian therapy.
Right. So
what it did was it would ask you questions that it could understand, and if it ever came to a block, it would just jump back to something else and had sort of pre-programmed. It was amazingly compelling.
It was fun. And it all came down to, when it couldn't figure anything out, it would say, so tell me, how did you get along with your mother? And it would always kind of go back to something like father or mother, and that's when it was confused. But we've come a long way since then with artificial intelligence, and yet I haven't seen it in learning, and that's what you're probably more in touch with that side of it. I'm curious as to what you've seen.
Yeah, AI is incredibly tough, and so we have made progress, and yet not the conceptual leap that's really amazing. The big things that have done, like Deep Blue and I forget the name of the Jeopardy thing, both were done not the way humans would do it.
Watson.
They just applied computational pressure. There have been some interesting approaches, but I would suggest that one of the most interesting adaptive environments are games, where you're programming in, not branching scenarios, but really engine-driven games, and where they are calculating, you build a deep model of the domain, capturing just the relationships you want the learner to understand, and then you program in a bit of random variability, and you can get them to scale in the level of challenge to adapt to your performance. You can get them to throw in enough variability to challenge you in important ways. That, to me, is still some of the most interesting things. There have been some really interesting technologies for chatbots. I worked briefly for a company that had created one using Blackboard technologies. And I don't mean Blackboard, the commercial thing. I talk about the artificial intelligence version. But you had to do a lot of customizing and knowledge stuff, customizing a lot of knowledge base underneath it, which is why it hasn't been practical. The same thing with intelligent tutoring systems. They're awesome in their power, but it takes such a deep model of the domain that it doesn't scale well. And I don't think we're going to get there. I was working on a system a decade ago, and I now know some companies that are doing a similar thing now, where we were trying to understand who you were as a learner. And we would characterize and profile you. We identified 31 dimensions. We ended up putting 9 in the first system. We got it up and running. And it would then alternate what you'd see in terms of your learning objects, and we broke it down to a fairly fine granularity. So an example was different from a practice, was different from a concept. And depending on who you were as a learner, you'd actually have a different experience. Even that was fairly complex and was doable then, but the market wasn't anywhere near ready. Now we're beginning to see other people taking shots at that, particularly using deep analytics. But I think that you can do it in sort of non-semantic ways, but the semantics is still a difficult problem that we're seeing some interesting, unique things, but their generalizability is still going to be problematic, and I think it will be for at least a few more years yet.
Yeah. Now, do you know of any game engines specifically built for learning? I haven't really come across any, at least recently.
Well, you got to be careful. Game engines, everybody wants. I've created a graph that's on my blog where there's tools that give you some power and some programming ability, but at a certain point, everybody goes, well, what's the best game engine? They want to have an engine that makes it easy to create games in any domain, and I say it's a programming language. It starts with Flash and simple things, and then you get up to Objective-C or whatever it is. Because the models you build, even for what seem like very similar domains, end up being extremely different. So I've seen some great learning games. I've built some, but there is no engine that makes it easy for you to put any game into, and fundamentally I think there can't be.
So just a lot of programming at this point still.
It's going to have to be. Well, it's modeling, and if we make better modeling tools, but it's modeling the domain and then putting an interface on top and tuning the experience to get the right level of user engagement becomes an important part of it.
Yep. Terrence, you look like you want to say something.
No, I was actually just replying back to one of the people in Twitter where he was getting back to what Clark had said about the video games and the PlayStation portables being part of mLearning or e-learning or depending on the context that it's taken. And he was saying how his 8-year-olds when they start playing their DS, all the kids start gathering around it, and there's really this element of extreme engagement. I mean, we look at it and we're like, when I say we, I'll say parents look at it and they're like, oh, my kid is just frying his brain on this stuff. But they're actually teaching themselves some incredible lessons. And some of the things I was saying was that they're teaching themselves about collaboration, dexterity, prioritization. They're learning all these things within these virtual environments of gaming.
Now, it's interesting. We had and this I guess I would call this social learning, but my wife had some of her friends over. They brought their kids over. We had our kids, so about 5 or 6 kids total. And they all came with their little devices. So all I was hearing for about an hour was beep, 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 beep. And I finally said, all right, hand them in, every one of you, give me. So they all grudgingly turned in their devices, and I said, now communicate. And do you realize for an hour, nothing. This is literally nothing. Just sat there. No communication. Finally, one of them said, do you want to play a game? And you could tell it was like speech, hard, no. And it was really interesting watching young kids, and they were all probably about 13, 15 at the time, not being able to communicate at all without their device. Take the device away, they just sat there kind of like a dead robot. It's like, okay. Within an hour and a half, they actually went off, played, had fun, came back about 2 hours later and looked like they were communicating. But it was real interesting how, to a certain point, we get so over-attached to devices, whether they be games or anything else, that that we miss the other side of learning, which is really just communicating with each other. It's kind of an interesting thing.
And so that situation can be applied to, you know, the those that aren't electronic or mobile savvy, where you put a mobile device in front of them and now they don't know how to communicate at all on this mobile device. So it does go both ways in that, you know, you have people that maybe they have developed a dependency or at least an attraction towards communicating via devices, and you have people that prefer the face-to-face, but you take either of them out of their comfort zones, and you're going to get that same effect of
they're totally lost. Yep. They're totally lost. And I think a lot of times when you tell people that, okay, here's a device, you can use this for learning, they freeze. People immediately think back to school and go, I wasn't good at math. Well, this isn't math, or I wasn't good at this or that. And it's interesting, you have to kind of retrain them to say, no, this device is your friend, you can learn from it, you can learn with it, if you will, and you can use it for other things rather than just. One thing I liked that Clark was saying is that really it's not just about an authoring tool, it's about putting it all together. And that smartphone can do a lot of different things, or the tablet, that in one way or another could lead you down a whole mess of different paths of learning and discovery, and that's the fun part of it. And yet at the same time be efficient, learn from, be productive.
Yeah. Now, Clark, I've noticed that, and I've heard you, whether through eLearnChat or whether through some of your presentations, where you've talked about training versus learning, and almost to the point where, you know, training is becoming a bad word, in your vocabulary. And I was wondering if you can elaborate a little bit more on you know, the difference between the two, why there's the gap is spreading between the two, and just sort of what your overall thoughts are on that.
I think the reason, and you know, my colleagues and I are out there saying, you know, blow up the training department, and don't necessarily mean get rid of it or kill it. I end up saying, you know, it's about making its responsibility broader. But
sure.
There's several reasons to think why, you know, training is going to be increasingly problematic. Things are moving faster and getting more complex at the same time. So you did a work with the airplane manufacturer, and their software, you don't fly an airplane, a prototype airplane anymore in a wind tunnel. You test it through software, and the software is getting complex, and they finally just couldn't keep up with training on every new release of software, and they were requiring more and more of it. So they finally had to put it in a wiki. And the point is, you're no longer going to be able to go away, plan, prepare, train, and then execute. Optimal execution is just going to be the entryway, but it's going to require a bit more flexibility and speed than training is going to be able to accommodate. And most of the formal learning we see in training, for the reasons we have already talked about, doesn't work well. It doesn't stick. It's a waste of time and money. You do software training, then the software rollout's delayed, and by the time it's out there, everything they were taught is wasted. And as Charles Jennings says, you know, you'd be better off buying a beer and letting them go to a pub and socialize, because at least they'll know who to talk to, who else is using the software. Mm-hmm. So formal learning's broken, and you know, the training. And when you use the word learning, and in fact, Jay Cross has put it on his list of words not to use, the 7 words you don't say to executives, and includes learning because they immediately think of training. I talk about big L learning that includes, you know, when you are doing research, when you're problem solving, when you're innovating, you don't know the answer, and so in a sense, you're learning as you do. So I want to stop breaking down these artificial barriers and start saying we need to support all of this, all of the organizational learning. And increasingly what's going to make a differentiator for organizations is continual innovation. I mean, when somebody can clone your iPhone, you know, you've got your iPhone, and as soon as it's announced 2 months later there's copies of it, planning, preparing, executing just doesn't make sense. You're going to have to continually innovate, and that's where you need more a wider definition of learning, because you don't want to take it for granted. If your culture is broken, people won't share, and yet sharing is part of what's going to be required. If you need, and you want to develop the skills, you want to develop the infrastructure, you want to start supporting people and scaffolding people and looking ways to optimize it. That's where the opportunities are. I want to briefly go back to something, though. You know, talking about that AI, Rick, was that the big picture would be systems that are smart, that know what you're doing and can optimally pull on it. That's a big dream. I think it's possible, but so far, I think we're still going to have to custom design a lot of our solutions. I think games are the next best learning environment next to mentored live practice, and it scales better because mentored live practice, if you fail, it might be expensive, and mentors don't scale very well either. So simulations of games. And when we start thinking mobile, one of the opportunities on the table are these alternate reality games. So instead of going away and practicing in a simulation and then coming back to real life, could we be distributing it across real life? And increasingly, when you perform using tools like this, your iPhone, and when you perform using tools like your tablet, could we build those into your learning experience and have them deliver these simulations and games as part of it? So you are, for instance, we did a demo to sales training ARG a number of years ago, where you would get emails and respond and call the person back, and you'd get their voicemail, and you leave voicemail, and then they'd send you a text message or whatever. We can do this. And these are the tools you use to do business now. Can we simulate that and create alternate reality games that are training you using the tools, and if you design it well, they're engaging as well.
Yeah, that's true. And the only thing is getting the cost down so that it's actually doable, because most clients don't want to pay for something very, very complex. Now, for example, Thursday, Terrence and I are working on a project with LA County where he's going to be going out to one of the fire department centers where they have a virtual, I guess it's kind of a virtual reality machine that can create all sorts of disasters and then have you deal with it. And it costs a fortune. But the thing is, it's very realistic as far as what it's programmed to do. It can deal with fire, earthquake, pandemics, and in this case, we're doing a pandemic training. But really fascinating what they've done with that. And I've seen this with the USDA on the Forest Service. They have flight simulators that train pilots how to deal with emergencies, with fires, with cattle stampeding, whatever, and how to get things back in order. And they do that through simulators that are actually pretty realistic and have just enough artificial intelligence built into them that they can, at least like you said, in that domain, they know what to expect and what the parameters are, and they can work around those. It's pretty interesting stuff, but it's very expensive. I know that one system that the USDA bought was about $1 million. That's a lot of money, and it's very complex, but for the average company, what do you think the solutions might be for them to embrace some of the mLearning concepts, and really also to be able to do it on a budget?
A lot of the stuff is there and is almost free. Almost any media file you've created, whether it's video, audio, or documents, PDFs, if they're not already, they can easily be converted to mobile accessible, and then you probably have a portal solution as well. So that's that's the low-hanging fruit. It depends. Mobile web is pretty plausible these days, and if you don't, and so that's not too expensive either. It's a little extra marginal cost on top of the development you're already doing, perhaps. Custom apps for different platforms where they're interactive and things are still difficult. But, and people tend to forget about other alternatives. You mentioned those simulations, the fire simulations. Those don't have to cost $1 million. If you can, the design is pretty much the same. It's good design, and I wrote an article for eLearn Mag where I said, better design doesn't take longer. There is a hiccup as you get comfortable with it, but then it's the same. You're thinking a little differently, but doing the same steps. Being able to manage this, you can think about different technologies. There is an entire flood simulation, emergency flood management simulation, run entirely through text messages. University of Aberdeen in Scotland did this. And increasingly, when you're managing an emergency, the California state, I think it's the water disaster things for spills, they have to run around, and they're using Twitter and Yammer or whatever to manage those things, to coordinate the different teams that are coming in, police and emergency staff and state, the state employees. They're running those simulations with Yammer. And they may have, they may not have it pre-programmed. They may be running it as a Wizard of Oz thing where somebody behind the curtain is manipulating things. That's okay. But it's amazing. It used to be, I got mad at the game companies. They wanted to, the game industry is incredibly competitive and cutthroat, and it's hard to get a publisher and to get the money all the way through. So they were looking for a more secure source of money and try to get into serious games, but they were telling everybody, oh, it's got to take millions of dollars to do it properly, because they have these teams of graphic designers and programmers and everything that they need to support. But there's so much that can be done with simple Flash games on the desktop, and there are ways to do simple things on mobile that don't cost the earth and yet will have an impact. They're $50,000, $100,000, $150,000 projects. So, it depends on what you're trying to do. As the consultants answer, it depends, but it does. But it depends on the scope of the innovation, how much you're trying to achieve, and what sort of platforms you're trying to deliver it on. But you don't have to be talking $1 million.
No, that's true. We used to tell people, they used to say, I want this, this, and this, and this. And they said, how much will it cost? We used to joke around that, if you need to ask the cost, you can't afford it.
Which is not a good way to go.
No, we were just joking with them.
I have done things all my life on the smell of an oily rag. I keep waiting for that really big budget. But once the Quest game we did for kids, when we first designed it, we got the playwright. And that was relatively inexpensive. Looked like it was done by a epileptic chimpanzee with crayon. Then we got they loved the play so well that we went out and got philanthropic funding to finish it. But even so, it was done very effectively on a very low budget. Effectively none, to be honest. But because I was academic time, I had a student do some of the programming for her project. But it's amazing. If you get the design right, there are lots of ways to implement it, and they can be low cost. If you don't get the design right, it doesn't matter what you implement it in.
Oh, that's true. In fact, look at Angry Birds on the iPhone, on Android, on the tablets. It's a simple game. It's nothing really intellectual. You just basically throw your birds at things. And however, it's interesting. Without realizing it, people are learning all about angles. They're learning about trajectories. They're learning about impact. And they're learning about hitting things and causing that to ripple in. They're learning a lot of stuff without any idea that they're learning physics while they're at it, or maybe calculus. It's really rather fascinating.
Well, absolutely. I argue against stealth learning. They have this claim, they'll learn all this stuff. I will suggest that they may not transfer that out to the real world where it would be relevant without some explicit supported reflection. I think games are really powerful. I don't think they're a complete learning experience in themselves. I think they could be. There's a really interesting research project, but it's not the way to bet. But you're absolutely. If you get the right, put the key decisions in at the core and wrap around that. And, there's a Antoine de Exupéry quote about, it's not when there's nothing left to add, it's when there's nothing left to take away. And we overproduce and underdesign, and I think I want to shift that very much.
No, that's good. That's true.
Rebecca Goldberg is on Twitter telling us that we're going to get in trouble with PETA because we keep giving these expressions about pigs with lipstick and dyslexic chimpanzees. So we've got to be fair to the animal kingdom today.
Okay.
I'm probably politically incorrect by mentioning epilepsy as well. But I've never claimed to be politically correct. I'm an equal opportunity insulter and will insult everybody.
We'll get along great.
Not human.
I'm totally politically correct. That's what they told me. Yeah.
I'm sorry, Don Boland is asking, oily rag, that's an expression I learned from Australia, running on the smell of an oily rag. In other words, you don't even have petrol, but you put an oily rag in there and the fumes are enough to run. In other words, having no resources, just to explain the expression.
And in today's day and age, most people don't know what burning the midnight oil is either.
Well, I wasn't aware of that, but yeah. Language changes. Euphemisms change. They're probably using ones that I wouldn't recognize, so fair enough.
It's true. Any other comments in the chat room, Terrence?
No, not really. I guess I have a final question for Clark, and we do have some viewers that are, most of our viewers are definitely in the e-learning field, but we do have a few conventional ILT type consultants and trainers that are still focusing on brick and mortar. And with what we're learning about e-learning and mobile learning and just how that's changing learning concepts, or not even changing learning concepts, but at least bringing to light more effective ways of learning, what advice do you have for those that are conducting training or trying to stimulate learning within the brick and mortar environment?
The principles of engagement, and I focus specifically on e-learning design in the first book, but the principles of engagement hold true regardless. And the principles of good learning, you've got to get away from your objectives. The objectives tend to be broken first. The good little instructional designer goes to the subject matter expert, and the subject matter expert no longer has access to what they do. That's part of our cognitive architecture. It's compiled away, and you only have to look at the expert system failures in the 80s to understand this. So the subject matter expert doesn't have access, so it gives them a lot of knowledge. And the good little instructional designer says, okay, I'll make sure they know all that, which isn't going to which leads to inert knowledge, which won't be accessed when it's out in the workplace and needed. So the instructional designer has to take more responsibility, whether face-to-face or online, to get at meaningful objectives. What decisions do they need to be able to make differently? And from there, then you want to put those decisions first and foremost. Focus on that, help them understand viscerally, and use that to drive them to the knowledge resources to be able to accomplish it, as opposed to, first we're going to introduce them, we're going to present the concept, present examples, finally get to practice. By then you've lost them. So, and this is true, give them meaningful tasks in the instructor-led class. Focus on meaningful changes, help them get it, minimize the amount of time they spend doing anything but trying to perform. And I think Kathy Moore's action mapping is a really nice. It's interesting. It didn't come necessarily from the theoretical perspectives. It came out of intuition, but it's a nice model. It says put first of all the things they need to be able to do, and then what the least amount around it. And that's a good principle for mobile as well. I do talk about the least assistance principle, and without meaning to be rude, I say, what's the least I can do for you? And that was John Carroll's minimalist instruction, said, give credit to what they know, figure out what the least to get them going, and do that and nothing more. And in the classroom, figure out what's the least I can do to get them able to do the task, and put the task up front, and what's the minimum to get them to succeed, and make sure that you've got enough practice so that they will retain it over time and transfer it all appropriate situations, which we don't do, by the way, is another cognitive thing. But the principles are channel independent. Doesn't matter whether it's mobile, e-learning, face-to-face. Good learning design is good learning design.
And in fact, more often than not nowadays, trainers in a lot of the large companies are really proctoring the training. They're not only presenting the training, but they're bringing in elements of e-learning. They're bringing in elements of video, chat, other things right into the classroom. So it is already starting to go beyond just the teacher talking to now there's a whole mess of other elements involved which make a difference. Again, hopefully there's a little bit more retention with all that.
Well, that would be the desire and the hope. I hope that answered your question, Terrence.
It absolutely did. Thanks so much. And is there anything that you'd like to tell the audience about upcoming places where you'll be speaking? I know there's a mLearn conference in San Diego coming up. I'm sure you're going to be there.
Actually, this year it's going to be in San Jose, and
San Jose, that's right.
Will be there. I'm going to be in Sydney for anybody who's watching from Australia, attending the Australasian Talent Conference, and then LNET's running a couple workshops in the subsequent week. The Distance Learning Conference Distance Learning and Teaching Conference in August in Wisconsin, Madison, Wisconsin. And, the Innovations in E-Learning Conference that the Defense Acquisition University and George Mason University together run in the beginning of June is a very nice little conference if you can get there. Just off the top of my head.
Where's that one held?
It's held at George Mason University in Washington, D.C.
Okay.
Well, great. And the book is Designing mLearning. And people can go to the website, designmlearning.com. Or pick it up on Amazon, right?
It's available on Amazon, Kindle version. Don't know if they've got a Nook version of it yet. They should. I've badgered them about it, but we'll see.
Great.
Yep.
Well, thanks so much for being on the show, Clark. We really appreciate it.
Well, thank you, Rick and Terrence. It's been fun.
Oh, it has been. I'm glad you could make it. And for all of you in the chat room, thanks for watching. And next week we've got Kevin Thorne from Learning Nuggets. So we will see you all again next week. Thanks a lot for coming and subscribing. We'll see you soon. Thanks a lot, everyone.
Take care. Have a great one.